Thank you, Tom, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be here again. It's great to see all the familiar faces out there. And with regard to not inviting Tom, yeah, we screwed up on that. But you know, I always used to kid that the only way I could get invited to a workshop on resource description was to organize it. And so that's what we did, and I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about how that went. Okay, so it's actually not 21. I think we're now 22 years, right? So I don't know whose idea this was to, so now we can go out and have drinks. But we've been in business for more than 2 decades now. So I've got kind of 4 different parts to this talk. How did we get this thing started? Why did it happen? What were the conditions that we really need to assure the success of what we were doing? What were the major problems that we ran into, and how did we address some of them, and of course failed at others? And then just a few personal reflections about what it's meant to me as an individual. So when I started at OCLC in 1985, I was 4 years away from my first email address, right? And the phones that we all have, so I have one of the little ones, 16 gigabyte phone. The memory in this phone, when I started at OCLC, would have cost $800,000 just for the memory, and 1 gigabyte of storage was about the size of a small refrigerator, like those dormitory refrigerators. And I remember when Tom came in to the, and was all excited that we were getting this big storage thing, and that 1 gigabyte of storage served the entire Office of Research for quite a long time. Cameras, well, cameras still used film, for heaven's sakes, and cell phones were, the size of the briefcases or the backpacks that we're carrying around. So mark cataloging was it. If you wanted to find out what was in the world's libraries, and we all know where you had to come to do that. And of course, there was no end user access to the global library catalogs. And that, if there's anything that's happened in my career at OCLC that I think has changed access to libraries, that has to be it. And that only happened 10 years ago, really. Okay, so in 1993, we were talking about this at lunch. All of a sudden, everybody was talking about the web. There was an article in the New York Times by, I think, John Markoff that kind of brought it to everybody's attention. It had been going for a couple of years, but it became really serious and broadly came into broad awareness of the public in January of 1993. And my then boss in research, Terry Neralt, came in and asked, about this web stuff. You seen this stuff? Yeah, I've seen a little bit about that. We need to pay attention to that. It's a pretty strategic library technology. So would you be interested in looking after that? And I said, sure. Yeah, so we did. And a couple of weeks later, Terry and I made a trip to NCSA and talked to Joseph Hardin, who ran that group there, and he was interested in bringing libraries into the mix, and that was just weeks before the first World Wide Web conference at CERN. And so as soon as I got back to Columbus, I tried to sign up for the conference. It was oversubscribed already. So I frantically called Joseph up and asked him, is there any way you can get me into the conference? And he did, of course. And boy, that was the, for me personally, that was the beginning of something really very, very important. So the first conference took place at CERN in Geneva, where the web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee and Robert Caillou. And it was a very exciting event. The second conference was organized for a mere 6 months later. Now, those of you especially been involved in IFLA for this conference, you know that you don't organize an international conference for 6 months from now. It's virtually impossible. And it was pretty ragged for this time. But in spite of that, people were offering organizers bribes to get in, really. I don't think that's happened for a while. So this is really where the World Wide Web browser mosaic started on this desk. This is Joseph Hardin's desk at NCSA. And from that chaos emerged this technology, browser technology that wasn't the first browser. The people at CERN did the first browser, but they only did it for, I think, Next machines. And of course, nobody had Next machines except for a few people. And so the folks at NCSA recognized this and immediately set about putting together a browser that would work on all of the major platforms at that time. And that was particularly important for Eric and I because we had just spent a couple of years working on, well, Eric had been writing the code for 3 different sets of code for this digital library project we were working on. And we saw the Mosaic stuff and said, well, duh, that's what we should have done. So anyway, we're in Chicago at the Congress Hotel. Now, how many people remember the 1968 Democratic Convention, right? So do you remember the riots and the people in helmets and all of that? And it was a pretty nasty thing. Didn't work out so well for the Democrats. That was the previous event that happened at the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And believe me, in the intervening 20 or some years, there hadn't been any upgrades done. So this was a dumpy, rundown hotel, but in the middle of Chicago, and we could get it on short notice. And so that's what happened. The conference took place there, and it was really an exciting thing to be at. And at that point in time, there were about 500,000 web addressable resources in the world. Right? Now, OCLC probably has more than that in its web server right now, right? Something like that. Okay, so the natural question was, well, how can we make things a little bit easier to find on the web? And 5 of us, Joseph Harden, who led the team, the Mosaic team, URI Verbinski, who is an amazing person we could talk all day about, Terry, Eric, and myself were just having coffee between sessions, and it was Uri who actually said, well, why don't we have a workshop? And Uri was like that. He just said, well, why don't we do something? And would point to somebody and have them do it. And I remember looking at Terry, who was my boss, and Terry smiled and nodded or something like that. And I just said, well, Eric and I'll do that. And that's really how it got started. So I really wouldn't have been invited to such a thing, but since we organized it, even though we missed a few people that might have wanted to come, we started that. So, this was a frantic time in web history. They were having 2 web conferences every year. And again, these are major events, and it was just an amazing period of very rapid growth. So WW2 was in mid-October, and WW3 was planned for Darmstadt in April, just 6 months later. And we wanted to, of course, do something that we could present at the next web conference, and so that's what we did. So when Eric and I got back to Columbus and realized the mouthful we had bitten off and had to chew for the next few months, well, what do we do? And we just kind of figured, we knew a lot of people in the web community at that point in time, and of course, we're at OCLC where resource discovery is, there's a fair amount of expertise in that sort of thing here. And so we just kind of made up a list of people that we knew that would be interested in working on this problem and could bring some interesting insights to it. So we tried to put together a list of people that we called even then the geeks, the freaks, and the people with sensible shoes. So there were internet technology types. There were people that had content specialties or markup specialties that we needed to include, and of course librarians. And the goal was pretty simple, is just to identify a small set of consensus elements that everybody could pretty much agree on that could be used to describe electronic resources. And we ended up with a set of 13 elements that came out of that workshop. And then over I think in the next workshop, or maybe the one after that, we ended up under pressure enlarging the set to 15. And it basically, now this is the lie if you don't know this yet, but it never changed after that. There were all these 15 elements. Now I could spend a whole other hour talking about why that's utter nonsense. But it was a good story. And it kept the set small, and you actually could use Dublin Core to describe something with those 15 kind of general buckets for descriptors. So the founding principles that we were trying to achieve then, first of all, was consensus. We just felt like, well, all of these different communities, we're trying to bring many different communities together. They all have different vocabularies. They all have different perspectives about how to describe resources. So we need to carry out this activity as a consensus-driven activity, and we did. It had to be cross-disciplinary. We wanted it to be as general as possible because we wanted everybody to play the game, but of course it had to be web-centric. All right, so it had to work on the web, and it had to be cross-disciplinary, which was both one of its strengths and over the long term turned out to be one of the problems as well, is that we're trying to be the same thing to many different communities, and that turns out to be difficult, and it turns out to create problems on who actually owns it and keeps it and maintains it. So it's the World Wide Web, right? So it's not just American, it's not just French, it's not just German. It has to be international, it has to be multilingual, and that presents lots of interesting challenges. And we recognize that we were never going to be the only kind of metadata out there. We weren't, even at that point we weren't. So we thought of this as an extensible set that we'd build on, a base where you start the process of describing resources, organizing resources, and that it would be extensible, that you could always add on to it. So those were our founding ideas that motivated us. We had the workshop. It was that conference dinner was at the Worthington Inn, as I recall. It's the only time I've ever drank significant quantities of alcohol in the OCLC building. We had some late night sessions that went on in some of these conference rooms, and boy, I'll tell you, I didn't drive home that night, and it was a very good thing. So we had that workshop, and we reported out the results at WW3 in Darmstadt a few months, well, it was just really 1 month after the workshop. And then, Eric and I got back from Germany, and, well, that was interesting, but now what do we do? And we didn't really have a good answer for that until I got a phone call from somebody I didn't know who worked for an organization that I didn't know, UCOLN, the United Kingdom Office of Library Networking. And Lorcan Dempsey called and said in his very charming accent, cross British and Irish accent, asked us if we might be interested in extending the workshop idea and having one in Bath in England, or actually in England. It turned out to be at work. Yeah, sure. So yeah, why not? Let's do that. And so really the long and the short of it is that just one thing led to the next. And so we had, I don't remember how many of these we did, maybe 4 or 5 of them were workshops, and they were invitational. So not because we thought we knew everyone that should participate in these or that we had some deep insights in the problems, but rather we just wanted to keep them tight and focused, and so we invited them. But before long, we opened it, we just basically opened it up to anybody who wanted to come could register and attend one of these workshops. And again, since we wanted very much to be international and to make these things attractive all over the world, we tried to hold them in lots of different places. So the first one was here in Dublin. That's why it's called the Dublin Core. The next one, number 2, was in Warwick in the UK. We had another one back here, which was number 3. And then we really set about the task of making this as international as we could. So we went to Australia, and we went to Asia and South America down the road. Ultimately, the DCMI workshops and conferences became the major place in the world where people would gather and talk about general metadata sets. And I think it's a fair thing to say that perhaps the most important thing about the whole activity was that community building and the fact that we provided a place where people could come and exchange ideas. So the metadata element sets themselves are not really the most important part of the whole picture. They are important, but it was that notion of bringing together people from lots of different communities, from lots of different disciplines together in the same place to talk about metadata that still drives the global discussion on metadata. Okay, so I guess what I'm saying here is that metadata is social. It's really about social engineering, about bringing people around to the same perspective, so that even though they come from different traditions of resource discovery, resource description, you could end up talking the same language in the long term. So the products then. These are really the four major categories here. First of all, semantics. What are you actually trying to say? What are the elements that you're using to describe resources? And that's what became the 15 elements. And we spent years talking about, how to modify them, how to make them more general or less general, this, that, and the other. But the general notion of what these things mean, you want people to look at the element set and say, yeah, I sort of get what that means. Syntax. Now, I think it's one of the smarter things that we understood at the very beginning, the very first workshop, that thou shalt not discuss semantics and syntax in the same room at the same time, because it inevitably gets all tangled up and becomes a mess. So we knew that from day one, and we still got tangled up in it in many, many different times. But in general, I think it worked out, keeping them separate and dealing with them in different venues. And again, getting back to this consensus, we needed to bring as many stakeholders as we could into the same rooms and get them to basically agree to do things the same way. And so this term network effects that became much more popular later on, that's what we're trying to do, is get more and more people to recognize the usefulness and the validity of this basic set of elements, and then because of that, it would become intrinsically more valuable. And then the community, a place that you could actually get people together and to talk about these things on a regular basis. So what do we need to make that happen? Well, this is my simplified list of the sorts of things that you have to get in place if you're going to make a metadata standard, or really any standard, work very well in a global way. And the first is an institutional home. And I've said many times, and I'm probably, I'm somewhat prejudiced about this, but I don't think there was any place else in the world that OCLC could, that DCMI could have grown up other than OCLC. The company has international stature. It has operational activities in its member libraries everywhere in the world, a community of expertise that knows about resource description. It's a trusted neutral party. Now, oddly, in a sort of funny way, that's probably less true in the library world than it is in the rest of the world out there, because there's always people that, well, OCLC's, it's a commercial organization. They're just, trying to get their membership fees. But even that is relatively a small deal in libraries. But when you get beyond libraries, OCLC had this international reputation for neutrality. People could trust that we weren't doing this just to increase the product footprint of OCLC out there in the world. And that was really true. And in fact, the first 3 or 4 years of Dublin Core's existence, most of the upper management in OCLC didn't even know what we were doing. They might not even have heard of us. We had all a lot of the expertise that you needed to do this sort of thing. And the other thing was the company had a willingness to invest. And that was really important in the early years of the company in general. Now, we did go through sort of stages, right, of not of denial, but of affirmation at OCLC. The first 2, 3, 4 years, it was like, Dublin, what? What's that all about? And then, gradually people in the company started to realize what we were doing, and it got to they're talking about us. And OCLC benefited quite a lot from the good press that Dublin Core generated. It was also, DCMI was, one of these new web technologies. And so it was a way for the library to make a bridge into the web community and in the other direction as well. So the company got richer intellectually because of that. And certainly the web community got richer because of the expertise that the library community in general could bring to bear. But, eventually you get to the point, well, okay, we keep paying out all this money for this. And again, another irony of the activity, Dublin Core was not then and is not today the central resource discovery idiom for libraries. It's, still MARC. Dublin Core has had an impact on that and is part of many libraries and the information systems that they support. But, the main show is MARC. And so, there came a time when there was somewhat less enthusiasm for supporting the Dublin Core, and the Dublin Core itself really needed to become more independent of OCLC and kind of stand on its own. So that's kind of what happened. I'd like to give some special credit here to actually a number of people in the room today, but two of the people who are not here, Terry Neralt, who was Director of Research at the time that we got started with all of this, and Jay Jordan, who was OCLC's CEO. Terry was an enormously supportive boss, mostly because he just, I figured out fairly early on that he didn't really care about the details. Go out and do good things. And as long as you don't embarrass us, you decide where you go, you decide what you do. And that's a pretty enlightened management style. And Terry was very good at that. And anybody at OCLC who worked for Terry will tell you that that was his greatest strength as a supervisor. And Jay Jordan, who I was happy to see just a couple of nights ago at IFLA, was CEO for something like 15 years around here, and he was really a big supporter of the Dublin Core. And if it hadn't been for their support, we would have had a tough time. There's a half a dozen people in the room today that were there at the beginning. Gene Godby wrote the first project report from that very first workshop and has been involved off and on for many years. So as well, both of the Erics in the room. We've got a lot of people here today that were involved in the early days, and some of them worked at OCLC. This is the building the way it used to work, and right up in that top corner, that's where my office was. So now you've seen where Mosaic started, and that right there is where DCMI started, sort of. Kind of. All right, so here's a good question. We live now in the age of Google. We hadn't seen Google yet when we started all of this, but if you're going to find something in the internet, well, we all go to Google for the first thing. So we had this first workshop, and we had to ask ourselves, now what do we do? And then Lorcan called, and we thought, well, okay, we'll have another workshop, and that's what researchers do, right? And so we did that, but you're always asking yourself, especially in the first years, who really cares about this? Is it really important? And the fact that this person in the UK called up and said, this is something that's very important to us, we'd like to build on what you're doing. That was a reinforcing thing. A couple of years later, I was at some sort of a little workshop, digital library workshop in Bonn, Germany, and there were some papers there, that researchers in Bonn, or in Germany, came to present. And this was kind of an epiphany for me, because these people who I'd never met, I didn't know about their project. In the brief time, it was maybe a year and a half in, maybe 2 years into the Dublin Core, these people, Roland Schwansel and Judith Blumer, came and described an implementation of the Dublin Core. Now, there were already implementations among the people who were actively developing it, but these were people who had not been part of developing it. They were people who had a problem for distributing, I think it was mathematics archives, and describing them in a way that they could be retrieved. They saw the Dublin Core and said, yeah, that'll work for us. And they just went out and did it. So for me, that was a very exciting thing to say, gee, we've done something that strangers just picked this up and said, yeah, that'll work for us. And they did it. So that was kind of an important milestone for me. And then this was also about the time that there were clearly hot spots in the world where metadata was being done. And interestingly, none of them, except at OCLC, were in the US. They were all in, they were in the UK, in Germany, in the Nordic countries, and in Australia. And these people started coming out of the woodworks and indicating that they wanted to play. They wanted to be part of the development process. So when I say we tried to organize workshops, where there were people who were really active in it. That's what drove us. And from that point, for quite some number of years, all of the workshops and ultimately conferences were in places where there were hotbeds of metadata research. So through that process, this community started to coalesce around DCMI, and it was initially just all basically project-based, but it was starting to grow into communities where there were not just people making the projects, but they were users. There were people that were using their systems and were actually benefiting from this metadata stuff. And the variety, and we were pretty successful with this early on. This notion of having lots of different, a very broad-ranging element set. So we had museums who were interested. There were professional societies like the mathematics folks. There were government agencies. The educational technologists came to understand that this was a very important thing for them to be concerned about. And actually, a lot of the politics of the coming years in those years had to do with educational metadata. And others, including libraries, although oddly, even though DCMI was based at OCLC, the world's premier library networking organization, but libraries, again, they already had MARC cataloging, so they didn't have this urgent need. They did recognize that they had to be able to describe internet resources and that MARC was way too expensive a tool to deploy to do that. So libraries were interested as well. Okay, so we had communities of developers, we had communities of practitioners, but one of the things that you need to have for something like this to work is you've got to have constant attention. And in order to have constant attention over a number of years, you have to have people who are really interested in the kind of difficult, what I think of as juicy research problems. And so in those middle years in particular, when we were organizing first the workshops and then the conferences, we tried to involve a lot of people that were practitioners that were actually on the ground making resources available to other people, but also researchers. And it was, getting back to it, the geeks, the freaks, and the people with sensible shoes. We needed those web technologists to be interested in this because we couldn't really, a small group of people couldn't handle all of that in a technology that was moving as rapidly as the web technology. And we did a pretty good job of achieving that, and I think it's still the case that you go to a Dublin Core conference and you've got those practitioners, you've got people who are doing projects, but you've also got people who are really pushing the forefront and trying to drive the technology drive the metadata deeper into the technologies. So standardization was key. We really needed to do the standardization bit. And that turned out, none of us were standards wonks at the beginning of the process, but by golly, we became them as time went on. And we took really a three-tiered approach to standardization. The first one was the easiest one. Eric and I had spent a fair amount of time working with people in the Internet Engineering Task Force, and we used that basic, very simple bare bones standardization process to publish the element set. And it gave it sort of a sheen of formality, right? It was a little bit of smoke and mirrors in that regard, but it was a stake in the ground. And we said, this is what these elements mean. And if you're going to do metadata for electronic resources, use them. So that was easy. That we knew how to do that, and we just had to write it up and send it in and jump through a couple of hoops, and it was done. Well, then we got to the heavy lifting part of the standardization process, and it turned out that turned out not to be the ISO process so much as the NISO process, because we really had to convince practitioners out there. We had to convince people in a lot of different areas that this was a worthwhile thing to do, and we actually ran into a lot of pushback and a fair amount of political machinations. Is perhaps the most generous way I can put it. And then once we got the NISO standardization done, the ISO standardization was really pretty easy to get on top of that, so that wasn't too bad. And of course, these things have to be maintained as well, so they expire, so that's always kind of an ongoing part of what you're doing. So the other absolute requirement for the success of an activity like this is to have people of goodwill and common purpose. And I must say that in the 15 years of my direct involvement in DCMI, we had quite a lot of that. First of all, those of us in the library world, you know, it's what librarians do. They work for the common good, and you don't have to convince people that that's an important thing to do. They do it. But we also found there were lots and lots of people in the world of internet technology. They were similarly interested. You know, they were riding this wave of a new technology that was changing the world, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's the third great revolution of civilization. You know, you have the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, now we have the information revolution. And so people had a very strong sense that they were part of something that was important, that was exciting, that was really going to make a difference in the world. Now, you know, there's a dark underbelly to that, as we all know these days, and the 15-minute news cycle, and there's all sorts of problems on the internet, but I guess I still feel like it remains an important thing to have done and to have been a part of. You know, another thing about this is the first few years we did these in workshops, and the workshops were 2.5 days. You didn't have much time. And so you had a bunch of people that came together, and we had to be all on the same page and remember what we'd done last time and still agree on it, and then push that progress further. And you did that through a combination of plenary sessions and little working group sessions, but probably the most important part of it was the beer sessions, the night sessions, and it wasn't always just beer, but it was a very exciting thing to do, to walk around late at night through wherever we were having these conferences, and there were people, you know, with their drinks in one hand and their laptops, you know, on the desk, trying to sort out, you know, really hard problems. And, you know, one of these, I think it was the Helsinki meeting that I kept track of this, and I was there for 6 days. There were some activities before it and after it and that sort of thing. And in 6 days, I got 16 hours of sleep. And that was sort of kind of typical of most of these activities, and maybe it's the reason why people were able to actually reach consensus, because they just got so tired. They couldn't, they just had to agree. And that's kind of what it was. And early on, there was this pattern, you know, we all started, you know, chipper and excited about the things we were going to do for this workshop. And then about a day and a half into them, you thought, we're never going to agree on this. And it felt like it was all going to come crashing down. And for the first 3 or 4 workshops, you pretty much felt like if it crashes, we won't get back up. Now after that, you realized, okay, we're not going to die if we don't, you know, reach agreement about this, that, or the other. But the first 3 or 4 workshops, it felt like we were going to. And there was, you know, there's 3 times in my professional career that I was screamed at. I'm not talking about people raising their voices or even yelling. I mean, somebody was in my face screaming at me. And 2 of those times happened in Dublin core meetings, and we got through it. And we even remain friends. All right. So one of the things, you know, so it's a global thing, and we don't have any money to speak of. So we've got to get together, you know, once or twice a year and do these things. And the rest of the time you're working at a distance. You're doing email, and you're doing teleconferences and sharing documents. And if you've ever done this sort of thing, you realize pretty quickly that building trust between people is really, really important. You can't do this work at a distance unless you trust one another. And we had all of these people from different cultures and different places with different agendas, and we had to come to a point where we trusted each other, and we did. And that was really exciting. And I still am in touch with many of the people that were party to all of that. And it was a very exciting thing to do. So we had really serious disagreements, and we had to bridge language and cultural problems, but we did. And I think the workshops were really essential to that, because we got to know one another, and we were up and sleep deprived, and sometimes a little bit too well lubricated, perhaps. But it meant that we were a community of people that trusted one another, and that was a really exciting thing to experience. So the last kind of major part of assuring that we were going to succeed here was we had to support this international perspective. And it's the web, after all, right? You just have to do that, and you have to do it in lots of different places. And you've got to be hospitable to differences in languages and cultures. And that's extremely demanding technically. To actually achieve the ability, and we never did it perfectly or completely, but to achieve the ability to let people write metadata in their own languages using a common technology was really an important part of it. We put a lot of effort into that, and I think it paid off for the most part. And that remains an important part of the Dublin core, is you can get metadata defined in your own language for lots and lots of languages. I don't know what the current total is. It's a lot, 20s or something like that, at least. Okay, so, all right, so those were the conditions that we absolutely had to have in order to kind of really make any progress. And by the way, we didn't understand that at the outset. You know, we were amateurs. We did this, you know, we learned as we went along. And, but we got most of it pretty much right. But there's a bunch of bumps in the road, a bunch of problems that are difficult to, that make progress very difficult. One of them plagued us again almost from the very beginning, data modeling. And it plagued us so deeply that we changed the name of the group from the architecture group to the data modeling group to some other darn thing. And we, you know, thought, well, if we change the name, maybe we'll actually figure out what we're doing. And my view would be we probably didn't. So that's a problem, and it's a problem that you know, I think it seeps into every activity in an internet world where you're trying to solve problems with digital systems that are actually live out there in the real world. I have this thing called creeping elegance, which I you know, reared its head in a number of ways I'll talk about in a minute. The problem of business models is really a hard one. The fact that we were in a technological environment that was happening so fast and changing so fast. Do you remember people used to talk about web years, like dog years? You know, one web year is like equivalent to 6 normal years or something like that. And again, the difficulty of doing this in a global architecture is quite substantial. So the data modeling thing, well, most of us have heard or maybe even played around with entity relationship models. And you know, when you encounter this stuff early on, it's sort of a magical thing. You realize it's a great way to address a problem, and you've got a bunch of concepts and a bunch of things and relationships among them. So you map all of those out, and when you have a pretty good map of that, then you can solve problems with digital systems that exist out there in the world. Except that reality is a really messy thing, and there's this the difficulty of identifying the right level of abstraction, because you're not trying to rebuild reality. You're trying to build a model of reality that has just enough power to allow you to solve the problems that the real world is presenting to you. And if you try to make that model too rich, you run into difficulties. And every, you know, the big problem with entity relationship modeling is that it's so appealing at the beginning because our sort of superficial understanding of things says, oh yeah, I know exactly how those things fit together. But of course, as most of us in the audience here are librarians, one way or another, you realize that bibliography is a lot more complicated and messy than that. So it's an art, data modeling, and we didn't do it very well. And just to make us feel not so bad about that, I invoke Ferber, which is a big activity that goes on in IFLA activities. And Ferber has been going on as a modeling activity for about the same amount of time that the Dublin core has. And unless I'm wrong, I keep getting email about workshops for, you know, this or that aspect of Ferber. So it's my sense, even though I mostly sail and varnish now, it's my sense that Ferber isn't really quite baked. Is that fair? You don't have to answer. Okay. So Anyway, we shouldn't feel too bad about the fact that we had difficulty with this. So the difficulty then is to match the complexity of the model to the diverse and evolving problems, and especially with a general metadata set, which has lots of different problems. People are trying to solve different problems. So a single model underlying that turns out to be one of these problems of creeping elegance. Oh, well, we need to be able to do this. Oh, and there's that, and there's this other thing, and it keeps growing, and your model gets more complicated, and the more complicated it gets, the less useful it gets. And so I'm not sure that this problem can be wholly solved. I think it's one of those things that you just have to do an approximation and do the best you can and try to make that fit. And you know, those of you, there's a number of people in this room today who are much more experienced at modeling than I am. And so you may want to push back on this a little bit. But I would say that there's greater risk in a too complicated model than in a not complicated enough model. Anyone want to fight me on that? So knowing when to stop is kind of the key thing with that. Okay, so creeping elegance isn't just a problem of modeling. It's a problem of the essence of the data set itself, the element set itself. And so the Dublin core, you know, we said, oh, there's 15 elements, so it's simple. Anybody can figure out how to do this, right? But again, that was smoke and mirrors, because then we started to have element refinements. And so we would divide up the elements, and this element would have 19 refinements, and that element would have 3, and this other element would have some more. And then another community would come in and say, well, I need some of my own refinements. And so if you really got down to the nitty-gritty and understood all of these various refinements to the element set, then you ended up with a lot more than 15 elements. So we were always, right from the beginning, fighting this battle of people wanting to be able, oh, but my community needs this, so you have to have that in it. And you didn't want them to go away, so, you know, as often as not, we caved in one way or another, and the element set got a little bit complicated. It's tricky to do it, and we didn't always do the very best possible job at achieving that. So, business models. You know, my mommy didn't bring me up to be a metadata specialist, and she didn't bring me up to be a business person either. And this was one of the things that really made me crazy personally in the early years of the Dublin core. And I see from Stuart's reaction that it makes him a little crazy too. So as I said, you know, after a while, OCL says, oh, well, how much do we have to continue to pay for this, right? So we tried for years, and I think it continues, to find revenue sources. And it's really tough. So I said early on that the fact that this is a very general set that should be able to be applied to any document-like object, was the term we coined in the first workshop. But that means that nobody owns it. It's not just about books. It's not just about libraries. It's not just about museums. And if nobody really owns it, then they're not as interested in paying for it. So, you know, the business model of the library is fairly straightforward. You make things look free. And that's a great business model. It doesn't work for, say, Mercedes, but it works extremely well for libraries on a global basis. You get the society to pay to do the heavy lifting financially, to build the infrastructure to buy the books, and then you make them look like they're free. And that's a great business model. The users really like that. The business model of the web is not so very different, except now the people that are paying for it, well, first of all, it was governments, and then it was, the governments gave it to the telecoms, right? So now we pay for the internet through AT&T or Verizon, or, you know, name your favorite model, or favorite isn't the word I actually use with these organizations in general, but you get the idea. The cost is shared through a standard charging mechanism. What do you do with something like the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative? Well, I personally never figured it out. And, you know, we tried lots of different things, and I think that Stuart can tell you some stories about that as well. You know, the products of the initiative have to be free, because that's what happens in the internet. You've got to make this stuff available for free, or people don't adopt it. If people don't adopt it widely, then you miss out on the network effects. It's too general purpose. for a single organization like OCLC to be really enthusiastic and put as much resource in it as they need to. And the funding, the funding agencies like NSF in this country don't like to do maintenance stuff. If you're doing something brand new and getting people to, they helped us out, with travel expenses and that sort of thing in the early workshops, but they don't want to pay for it in the long run. And I think in Europe it's a little bit more, you're a little bit more likely to be able to find European Union funding that can be ongoing, but, there too it's difficult, and membership fees are difficult to sustain. So this is an ongoing problem, and it's one of the reasons why the Dublin cores always had to, be pretty lean, and we never really had as much resource to spend on solving problems as we wanted to. So again, web years, things are changing very, very rapidly in the web, and we had to be in there. And it turned out that we recognized two major syntax environments that we had to live in, and maybe a third one as well. And so you've got to do all of your syntax documents, all of your recommendations about this is how you do it if you want to build a Dublin core system. This is the technology you need to apply, and this is the expertise that you need. And again, this is all people had day jobs, and it was very difficult to write the specifications, HTML, XML schemas, RDF, linked data. You're going to hear more about some of these things later in the day. They're complicated, very technical standards that most people in libraries weren't in a position to deploy, let alone in many of the other domains that didn't have traditions like MARC cataloging and shared systems. So we tried to keep the semantics of the standards separate as much as we could, and mostly we were able to do that. But inevitably, we had to translate those semantic standards into a syntactic representation that would work in the web. And since the web was changing so fast, it was a real challenge, and we didn't always do a very good job of that. And again, getting back to this notion of global importance, it had to be global. So we had to, we had to do lots of different languages, and we had to go a lot of different places. Now, believe me, I enjoyed that a lot. We were talking at lunch. I have 32 stamps in my passports from different countries that I went to promote or to help develop metadata. And it was a very rich experience, which I enjoyed enormously. But it also, any of you who travel very frequently realize also the burden of traveling and how it makes you unhealthy. And so we had a lot of people running around the world, and many of them were involved in other global activities like web developments, and you just, the travel can wear you out. So it was exciting and interesting, and I'm grateful, so grateful to have done it, but it took its toll. In 2001, when the attack in New York happened, flying for a lot of us stopped for quite some number of months. And at that point, I was just sick almost all the time. I just always had this low-level virus, and I was dizzy all the time. And I figured that I'd done some damage to my vestibular apparatus, and I was never going to be free of that, get over it. And then I stopped flying for a few months, and I got healthy. It was a real obvious demonstration to me what a burden it is to do that much flying all the time. So the last few things I'd just like to talk about is just to say what a thrill it was for me to be able to do this. Again, my mother, who now lives in Seattle, near where I live, is 92 years old. She still has no clue what I did for a living. Not a clue. And so, it's a pretty arcane thing. A metadata specialist, really. And especially when we started all of this stuff, we had to fight even to use the name. We got sued, almost sued. We got served papers saying that we couldn't use the term metadata because somebody had copyrighted it or some darn thing like that. Well, we just ignored it. And the rest is history, as they say. But it was, for me, who ended up in OCLC almost by accident because my wife was a librarian and I was looking for something new and interesting to do. And after having been here for a few years, ended up, got dropped into the web environment, and all of this stuff pretty much happened to me. I didn't plan it. I didn't have deep insights that made me the best person in the world to lead a metadata initiative. I just was in the right place at the right time, and I had an absolutely spectacular time. There's no greater privilege in life than doing work that you think is important, that's going to actually make a difference in the world, and that you can enjoy doing. And I really did. And heaven knows we screwed up many, many times in the conduct of this initiative. But at the end of the day, we're all still here. Again, there's half a dozen people in this room that were here almost right from the very beginning. And we've done something that is embedded out there in the world and that people really care about, and that makes their systems work better. And that's a really very exciting thing, and I'm very grateful to have been a part of it. So if you're ever in Seattle, look me up. Send me email, talk to me on Twitter or Facebook, and I'll maybe take you sailing if the weather's good. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.